The heavy, snow-laden silence of the Russian winter has always served as a somber backdrop to the unfolding of grand tragedies, and none is more profound than the collapse of the House of Romanov, a dynasty that ruled over 1/6 of the Earth's surface for 3 centuries. To understand the darkness that eventually swallowed this family, one must first look beyond the blood-stained basement of the Apadiev house and return to the shimmering gold leaf and polished marble of the Winter Palace in St. Petersburg. By the late 19th century, the Romanovs lived in a world of such breathtaking opulence that it seemed disconnected from the reality of the millions of peasants living in medieval squalor across the vast empire. The coronation of Nicholas II in 1896 was intended to be a manifestation of divine right, a celebration of an autocracy that claimed to be ordained by God himself. Yet beneath the surface of the grand balls and the clinking of Fabergé eggs, the foundations of the monarchy were already fractured. The Kodinka Meadow tragedy, where thousands of commoners were crushed to death in a stampede for coronation gifts, cast a long prophetic shadow over the new Tsar's reign. Nicholas, a man of quiet temperament and deep devotion to his family, found himself thrust into a role for which he was temperamentally ill-suited, inheriting a crown that demanded the iron fist of Peter the Great at a time when the world was screaming for the democratic ideals of a new century. The central tragedy of the Romanovs was not merely political, it was intensely personal, centered within the private walls of the Alexander Palace at Tsarskoye Selo. When Nicholas married Alex of Hesse, the granddaughter of Queen Victoria, she arrived in Russia as Alexandra Fyodorovna, a woman of deep piety and agonizing social anxiety. Her isolation from the gossiping circles of the St. Petersburg aristocracy pushed her deeper into a mystical, secluded world. This seclusion intensified with the birth of their long-awaited son, Alexei, the Tsarevich. The discovery that the boy suffered from hemophilia, a royal bleeding disease inherited through his mother's lineage, became the most closely guarded and devastating secret of the empire. For Alexandra, the constant threat of her son's death was an unbearable psychological burden, driving her toward an obsessive search for spiritual healing. It was this maternal desperation that opened the gates of the palace to Grigori Rasputin, a Siberian peasant and self-proclaimed holy man who alleged ability to stop the boy's bleeding gave him unprecedented influence over the imperial family. The presence of the mad monk within the inner sanctum of the Romanovs did more to erode the prestige of the monarchy than any revolutionary pamphlet ever could, creating a perception of a court ruled by dark forces and decadent mysticism, while the country outside began to simmer with the heat of industrial unrest and peasant hunger. As the 20th century progressed, the disconnect between the Romanovs and their subjects grew into an unbridgeable chasm. The Russo-Japanese War of 1905 ended in a humiliating defeat that shattered the myth of Russian military invincibility, leading directly to Bloody Sunday, when imperial troops fired upon peaceful protesters carrying icons of the Tsar to the Winter Palace. This event severed the mystical bond between the Little Father, as the Tsar was known, and his people. Though Nicholas was forced to grant a Duma, or parliament, his inherent belief in autocracy led him to systematically strip the institution of its power, ensuring that no peaceful path to reform remained open. By the time the drums of the Great War began to beat in 1914, the Russian Empire was a powder keg of systemic inequality and administrative rot. The initial wave of patriotism that swept through the streets of St. Petersburg, renamed Petrograd to sound less German, was short-lived. As millions of Russian soldiers, many without boots or rifles, were slaughtered on the Eastern Front, the blame shifted directly to the Tsar. In a fatal error of judgment, Nicholas departed for the front to take personal command of the army, leaving the government in the hands of the Empress and Rasputin. In the eyes of the public, the government had become a mousetrap of German influence and occult madness, setting the stage for a collapse that would be as sudden as it was absolute. By the winter of 1916, the atmosphere in Petrograd had turned toxic, a volatile mixture of freezing temperatures, breadlines that stretched for miles, and a profound sense of betrayal that reached into the very heart of the Romanov family.
The assassination of Grigori Rasputin in December of that year, orchestrated by Prince Felix Yusupov and Grand Duke Dmitry Pavlovich, was a desperate, aristocratic attempt to save the monarchy from itself, yet the removal of the monk came far too late to cauterize the wounds of the state. The Empress, devastated by the loss of her only confidant, retreated further into a state of hysterical mourning, while the Tsar remained at the military headquarters in Mogilev, increasingly detached from the reality of his crumbling capital. When the February Revolution finally ignited in 1917, it was not led by organized political parties, but by exhausted women standing in breadlines and workers who had reached the breaking point of human endurance. The refusal of the Petrograd garrison to fire upon the crowds marked the definitive end of Romanov authority. The soldiers, many of whom were raw recruits witnessing the suffering of their own class, turned their rifles against their officers and joined the surging masses. Isolated on his imperial train and blocked by railway workers from returning to his family, Nicholas II was confronted by representatives of the Duma who demanded his abdication. In a quiet, almost surreal moment of resignation in a train carriage at Pskov, Nicholas signed away 300 years of dynastic rule, not with a roar of defiance, but with the weary stroke of a pen, noting in his diary that night that all around him he found only treachery, cowardice, and deceit. The abdication of Nicholas II did not merely end a reign, it plunged the former imperial family into a limbo that grew increasingly perilous as the political landscape of Russia shifted from the moderate provisional government to the radical fervor of the Bolsheviks. Initially, the family was held under house arrest at the Alexandra Palace, where they attempted to maintain a semblance of their former life, gardening and teaching the children in a desperate bid for normalcy amidst the rising tide of hatred outside their gates. Nicholas seemed almost relieved to be free of the terrible burden of the crown, spending his days chopping wood and reading, yet Alexandra remained haunted by the loss of their status and the uncertain future of her son. The failure of King George V of Great Britain, Nicholas's cousin and dear Nicky, to provide asylum remains one of the most controversial footnotes of this era. Fearing that the presence of the Romanovs would spark revolutionary sentiment in England, the British crown effectively withdrew the life raft that might have saved them. As the summer of 1917 faded, the provisional government, fearing for their family's safety, or perhaps seeking to remove them from the center of political intrigue, moved them to Tobolsk in Siberia. It was a journey into the heart of the Russian wilderness, a journey that stripped away the last vestiges of imperial grandeur and replaced them with the stark, cold reality of a nation that no longer had a place for its Tsar. The October Revolution brought Vladimir Lenin and the Bolsheviks to power, and with them a new and lethal ideology that viewed the Romanovs not as human beings, but as the living symbols of centuries of oppression that had to be liquidated. In the spring of 1918, the family was transferred from the relatively relaxed confinement of Tobolsk to the industrial city of Yekaterinburg in the Ural Mountains. Their final prison was the Ipatiev House, ominously designated by the Bolsheviks as the House of Special Purpose. Here, the windows were painted white to prevent the family from looking out, and a high wooden palisade was erected to hide them from the world. The Grand Dukes and Duchesses, once the most photographed and envied youths in Europe, were now subjected to the taunts of their guards and the theft of their meager belongings. Nicholas, Alexandra, and their 5 children, Olga, Tatiana, Maria, Anastasia, and the frail Alexei, found themselves confined to a few cramped rooms, their world shrinking until it consisted of nothing more than the rhythmic pacing of the guards in the hallway and the dwindling hope of a rescue by the White Army. The tension within the house grew suffocating as the Civil War intensified, and the local Ural Soviet, increasingly paranoid and radical, began to prepare for a final solution to the Romanov problem, directed by instructions that filtered down from the dark corridors of the Kremlin. The final days inside the Ipatiev house were marked by a haunting, claustrophobic routine that masked the impending violence. By July 1918, the White Army, loyalist forces seeking to restore the monarchy, or at least prevent a Bolshevik total victory, was rapidly closing in on Yekaterinburg. This military pressure acted as a catalyst for the Ural Soviet, who feared that the liberation of the Tsar would provide a powerful figurehead for the counter-revolution. Under the command of Yakov Yursky, a cold and meticulous revolutionary, the Guards' behavior shifted from casual harassment to a grim, professional preparation for execution. The Romanovs, unaware of the telegrams flying between Yekaterinburg and Moscow, spent their last evening in a state of quiet exhaustion. On the night of July 16th, the family was woken after midnight and told they were being moved for their own safety due to the unrest in the city. With a chilling sense of obedience that had characterized their years of captivity, Nicholas carried his son Alexei down the stairs, followed by Alexandra and her 4 daughters, huddled together in the confined space, believing they were waiting for a truck to transport them to a new location. The illusion of safety shattered in an instant when Yursky re-entered the room with a squad of armed men. He stepped forward and abruptly announced that the Ural Soviet had passed a decree of execution. Nicholas, stunned, managed only to utter, "What? What?" before Yursky opened fire directly into the Tsar's chest. The basement immediately descended into a chaotic, smoke-filled slaughterhouse. The executioners, many of whom were intoxicated or inexperienced, fired wildly into the group. Because the Romanov daughters had sewn the family's jewels, diamonds, emeralds, and pearls, into the linings of their corsets for safekeeping, the garments acted as a makeshift suit of armor, causing bullets to ricochet around the room like lethal hailstones. This technicality